Hello, I'm George Maylim, the Managing Editor of Vanilla Plus, and welcome to today's webinar. The topic today is Service Assurance in the Era of NFV, Adapting to the Evolving Hybrid Telecommunications Network. The introduction of NFV and SDN has obviously been talked about for several years now, and there's a huge excitement because of the transformation potential it has for the telecoms industry. I'm delighted to look more closely at the service assurance aspects of these technologies today, and I'm delighted to welcome our panelists. From AssureNow, we have Drew Golden, the Senior Director of Product Management. He's joined by Anup Agrawal, the Vice President and Head of Enterprise Architecture and End-to-End Solutions at Ericsson. And both of those speakers are accompanied by Anil Rao, the Senior Analyst at Analysis Mason. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Anil, who will give you a brief presentation to set the scene for today's webinar. Anil, over to you.
Thank you, George, and welcome everyone. So here we have the agenda of the webinar today. We've just done the welcome from George. We're going to be broadly looking at three questions, and we'll try to address this in the form of a sort of a panel discussion between Drew, Anup, and myself, and we'll try to answer these questions at a broad level, and then we'll open it up for Q&A in the end. Moving on, let's take a step back and think about why we're talking about NFV SDN here. So 5 or 6 years ago, we started with this NFV SDN journey in the industry, and through various iterations, I think the whole industry sort of settled on what is the long-term driver to do NFV SDN, and I think there is a broad agreement now that it is really service agility that is going to be increasingly enabled by automation that will be the long driver. And this will basically enable CSPs to dynamically instantiate new services and continuously improve customer satisfaction. And what is this NFV SDN journey that we talk about on so many occasions? It's really, that's what I've tried to depict here on the left. At Analysis Mason, we see this journey in three broad phases. And I think it would be fair to say that broadly across the industry, we are trying to settle into phase one, fully understand the impact of virtualization, develop network functions in a software format, which we call as virtual network functions. So this is the whole phase around virtualization. So you will see a lot of the network functions being developed as in software format. And then we move into phase two, where we see a number of leading operators thinking about actually not only just virtualizing those functions, but also orchestrating them across the NFV domain, but then also starting to think about how do you orchestrate across both physical and virtual, because in this phase we will see more and more of the functions being virtualized. So we need to start thinking about how do you manage those functions across the physical and virtual, i.e. the hybrid networks. And then ultimately, we all want to get to a cloud-native network architecture where most of the network functions are virtualized, but also the orchestration functions and the support functions that sit on top, which is the control layer, are also in a cloud-native architecture, all working together harmoniously in a highly automated fashion. Now, if we take an operational view of this evolution to NFV SDN, a lot of operators say that their ultimate goal is to attain an autonomous or automated operational state. And you see on the chart on the right side, you see broadly 5 stages of a customer order journey, and these are the expectation is that these are all automated, and the handovers between these stages are all automated ultimately. So if you look at the first stage, it's you receive the customer orders and design the service, and you move on to manage those orders, decompose them, and provision the service. Activate and test the service, and then on an ongoing basis, you've got to assure and manage the service for service quality and customer experience, and then you ultimately modify during the service being live upon a customer's request, or you tear down the service because the customer just doesn't need it. So this life cycle of the service, starting from 1 going into all the way to 5, is intended to be in the form of an automated mode of operational state, and you add a self-service type of a portal on top. You're looking at customers being in full control of this journey.
Neil, thank you for your perspective on this. It's interesting, really, to understand how carriers' expectations for NFV are indeed evolving. Just out of curiosity, what are the challenges to achieve this future mode of automation, of automated operations?
Yeah, good question, Drew. Obviously, we are, with this picture here, we're trying to paint a future mode of operations. And this is not going to happen overnight, of course. So to achieve this future mode of operations, first of all, as an industry, and specifically CSPs and vendors, need to start thinking about having a mindset shift in mindset, so to speak, because the current mode of operations is the biggest challenge, because the operations that we have today have evolved over decades, and mainly cater to the way that the networks have been designed, and we are still designing as we speak for physical networks. So and if you look at the CSP investments, the capex by and large is flatlining, it's slowing, but the operational cost continues to grow. So the economics of the telecoms operations will need to be rethought for not just NFV, but the virtual networks will coexist with with physical networks. So which means you've got to operate hybrid networks for a number of years to come. So the mindset shift towards more automation is required even today, and not necessarily wait till fruition of an NFV strategy. So talking about hybrid networks here, I'll just move on to the next slide on how this really impacts service assurance. So now we get into really the crux of the discussion here. So what this means, we talk about virtual networks, hybrid networks. This actually creates a new set of requirements for service assurance. And the assertion is that currently the sort of service assurance we have cannot really fulfill the requirements of this new type of operations we're talking about. And why is that? So if you look at the left chart here, it's obviously oversimplified diagram, but hopefully it makes the point, is that on the left side you see the physical network domain, and on top of that you've got multiple NMSs, and then you've got a multi-vendor service assurance. By and large, this is the type of architecture we see today. But then as you introduce NFV enabled by SDN, and then you start to introduce network orchestration and control on top, because obviously the NFV functions will need to be orchestrated, as I was saying, in the second phase of the journey. Now the question arises, what about assurance for this NFV domain? And what about assurance for the hybrid end-to-end network? So that's what really the service assurance, the scope of service assurance at a very high level is about, and that's depicted on the right side here. So as you introduce more and more NFV and you introduce orchestration in the NFV domain, you've got to start introducing service assurance specifically for NFV. And for hybrid network assurance, and service assurance, you've got to start stitching the views from the physical and the virtual together in the form of end-to-end hybrid service assurance.
Neil, it seems odd. Why can't the legacy service assurance tools be extended to cater to NFV?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question that comes up a lot, because the obvious strategy would be to why don't you stretch the legacy SA across to cover NFV. There are reasons why. Well, you could do it, right? So obviously you can do a lot of enhancements and redesign of SA and so on and so forth. But I think the biggest barrier to do that is, if you take a step back, the legacy SA, as we depict here, was really conceived for physical networks, and physical networks, as we all know, were proprietary hardware based, whereas in the NFV, it is more of a disaggregated architecture, cloud-based architecture with hardware on cards and network functions as software applications. So primarily here we're talking about an IT and the network world sort of converging. So this is the NFV is really bringing the IT and the network convergence, and it's really making the ICT happen. So primarily the new SA must address this convergence, the complexity of convergence, right? Secondly, the dynamic nature of the NFV environment creates new requirements. For example, in this dynamic environment, the expectation is that service chains will be created on demand. The VNFs themselves, because they're software applications on VMs, the expectation is that they can move around, which means that the SA must rapidly adapt and keep track of the changing service topology. And thirdly, and this is talked about a lot, the biggest expectation from SA is that it must drive closed-loop automation. And we'll come back to that in the course of this conversation. But really, together, between the SA policy and analytics, it sort of forms the brain that will drive automation. So let's move on to the next slide and try to sort of take stock of where we are today. So we try to address from the start, where are we? What is the journey and what are the phases in that NFV journey? And we talked about the automated operations, future mode of operations, and then talked a little bit about the SA requirements in this world. But if we take a reality check on where we are and where we want to be, so that's the left chart here. So today, this is an example illustration of a mobile network, but you could extrapolate it to other networks as well. But really, as we moved and started to introduce new generations of mobile technology, going from 2G to 3G and 4G, and then you've got the backhaul that sort of is used across these mobile networks. Really, as from a service assurance perspective, we started to introduce siloed and dedicated tools because obviously the tools at the time were designed for that type of a network. So as new networks were introduced, there were new tools that were introduced too. So you ended up with a silo-based legacy architecture, silo-based legacy assurance architecture with a number of tools and systems, and then you needed similar type of tools and systems for the IT networks as well as cloud, private clouds started to be introduced, and you needed assurance for that as well. So if you are to start thinking about the future mode of automated operations and automation in general, then we have to start thinking about how do you unify this whole service assurance, the fractured estate of tools and systems that we have. So on the right side, you see on this chart, it's really trying to sort of bring together the concept of unified monitoring. What are the demands on unified monitoring? It is really trying to bring all of the components, all of the network domains, the IT domains, all of them together under one umbrella, unified monitoring solution. So we're looking at IT and networks as well as applications as well. legacy IT infrastructure, legacy physical networks, cloud infrastructure, supporting both IT and NFV networks, service performance and quality, and customer experience, which are increasingly becoming a source of competitive differentiation. And we see a lot of CSPs using service assurance and extending it, enhancing it to do service quality management and customer experience assurance. So all of this have to become a part of a unified monitoring estate.
Wow, and just noticing the legacy operation centers often look like a bowl of spaghetti. I'm curious, how do you transform this into something that's actually agile, flexible, and future-proof? And what would be the key indicators of success around that?
Sure. So what I've tried to explain here is, as I said, is the vision of the future mode of operations, and if you will, it's a sort of a blueprint in terms of the mindset shift that we need, right? So, and it is fair to say that this transition will not happen overnight. And also, we have a lot of the physical networks, and let's face it, right? I mean, these networks, even though we say legacy or physical networks, I mean, these are the assets that are bringing in revenue. So we have to continue to deal with it in a much more efficient manner, at a much more cost-effective manner. Plus, you've got the emerging hybrid network. So how do you deal with all of this, right? So telcos, industry in general, must take incremental steps towards achieving the future mode of operations, right? So from assurance perspective, we need to start thinking about, what aspects of your assurance estate you can start unifying, because NFV is going to introduce a lot of infrastructure complexity, right? So, and we don't want to introduce more and more operations complexity. So as you're looking at NFV, we need to start thinking about how do you simplify your current operations. So in that vein, look at service assurance and start, reducing the number of systems, tools, and rationalize those, right? Otherwise, NFV will probably never get done because of the operations complexity. So the idea is to take a unified approach to assurance, which can simplify operations, bolster the automation efforts, because unification, right? So obviously this diagram simplifies a lot, but there are proof points in the industry that unification actually breaks silos, saves costs, and I think it really forms the foundation for our transition to NFV operations. Great. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Drew from AssureNow. Drew, if you want to take over and provide your remarks.
Yeah, let me advance the slide if I may, and really, if I can just kind of consolidate or sum up, what we've just found out. Really, the need now is to take this pivotal moment or shift point to really simplify what we're doing. And so really, the direction forward, simplification might be moving towards managing on a single service platform, right? This would provide that operation center, that single pane of glass view across all of the siloed assurance architecture. It would provide, many service providers an opportunity to perform legacy tool consolidation. And, once all the legacy tools are consolidated, then new services such as NFV, at the time that NFV is orchestrated, at that point, or that shift, you can no longer do typical layer 2, layer 3 discovery because things are now virtualized. And for that deeper stitch to take place, you actually have to integrate in with the orchestration systems themselves so that at the time a service is turned up, you can perform that discovery of that virtualized infrastructure. And this allows many carriers to transition from network operations to really service operations. And at the same time, as all of these things are being carried out and you're introducing all of this agility through this single pane of glass, it's a really good opportunity to begin reducing the costs of operation because now you're focusing on a more agile platform.
Right. So true. You're suggesting a move towards a modern sort of a one platform approach. And having watched Monolith and then the company in the past, I know Air, an operator in the Republic of Ireland, a fixed mobile and broadband communications company, and one of the largest operators in Ireland, uses AssureNow. And has achieved some great results. Can you possibly elaborate on how they achieve these benefits using AssureNow?
Yeah, and actually that's a really good example, because you can imagine all of the legacy tools we're able to collapse. And so by shrinking those legacy tools, you can collapse multiple swivel chair opportunities into a single pane of glass view. And, just using Air as an example, they were able to perform a fairly significant headcount reduction, because you no longer need operators staring at all of these different screens. You have that single pane of glass from which you can view service, as disambiguated as they become. And that reduction in swivel chair actually allows you to focus on the services themselves. And through that single pane of glass, Air, as an example, was able to reduce their incident count by more than 75%, while at the same time retiring legacy tools and reducing operations costs. So if you allow me, I'll switch to the next slide. And you can see how this is done. By monitoring this new network world, specifically VNFs, the cool part about this is that you're actually able to discover network devices at its inception, which means you no longer have to worry about keeping legacy tools stitched together and legacy inventory systems. So as a service is turned up, because you discover that service at inception, you're able to keep all of your inventory systems constantly aligned to the new realities of instant service. And this discovery allows for both proactive and passive collection. So passive being the reception of traps and events, and proactive meaning actually reaching out and pulling these services and measuring the quality of the services provided. And this is all done through standards-based protocols, right? Many of these new devices, as they're introduced, are shifting away from SNMP and leveraging new APIs and new protocols. And so for us, it's an opportunity to reflect back callback methodologies so that we can do things like post-fault, or we can locally collect and store statistics. We can show transactional data, and we can actually perform complicated topology mapping and service chaining. Because remember, you're no longer stitching together layer 2, layer 3 topology of physical networks, but also showing how virtual containers are related to that physical topology. One other thing that happens with this new network world is that you want to perform things that are closed loop. So for example, as you can imagine, certain network devices may need to be snapshotted or backed up. And when you have closed loop assurance, and because we're stitched in with the actual devices and actual containers and knowing how those devices are snapshotted, we can actually stop faults from shooting out as we take down a VNF so that we can perform a snapshot function. And then as that NFV comes back up, then we can turn back on notifications. So some of the back-end things that would normally create interference in the operations center can be very neatly shut off so that it doesn't generate additional noise for the operations teams.
So, Drew, a question then, as you're going through your remarks. I remember earlier this year at Telemanagement Forum, TMF NEAS, you won an award for excellence for Business Transformation of the Year Catalyst project. Can you possibly elaborate on what was this project about and the type of use cases it addressed?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, we have done, a very large project where we stitched in with a platform that did network service turn-up using virtualization devices. And by performing that stitch, we were able to demonstrate both in NEAS and in an environment, production environment, that this stitch can happen, that we can transform legacy operation centers by doing that closed loop assurance, by snapping in with new orchestration tools as they come out, and by being agile enough to be able to certify these new network devices as they turn out. Remember, the new NFV world, these virtualized devices come faster and faster. It's as quick as they can turn out a new software release. And so taking the legacy approach of certifying over 6 months or 9 months is no longer acceptable. And so we demonstrated in these the ability to deliver at speed and the ability to stitch into these new networks and topologies and orchestration systems. So now, as you can see, AssureNow platform is the platform for unified service assurance. And, we believe it's the first solution in the industry that's actually gone to production and has provided support for NFV initiatives, both winning awards in NEAS and actually being in production today. So, we believe that we're the first project of its kind with Ericsson on a Tier 1 enterprise services deployment, that we've been agile and responsive in our development process by working directly with vendors and continuing to add new NFV support and new features and functions within the product itself. And finally, everything that we've conformed to, everything that we've done has been non-proprietary. So our platform is open. It's easy through our RESTful APIs to connect with all of these new systems as they come out from the orchestration side. And then from the back end, collecting the new network devices, the new topologies, and the new platforms under which they're evolving. And so it's been fun to be, as part of that new transitive state world, as you can imagine. So I'd like to invite Anoop to discuss really the critical business drivers behind this project.
All right, thanks, Drew. So basically, what you've heard so far are some really interesting concepts from Drew and Anil. Really appreciate that, guys. But what I want to really add value here is by bringing a real implementation that we did at a Tier 1 operator in North America, and Ericsson and AssureNow partnered to really bring that closed loop automation that Drew was just describing. So when we started this project, the customer that we engaged with is in the business of providing services to very large enterprises. Most of their customers are Fortune 500 customers, and these customers, put a lot of demand, of course, on in terms of needing new services to create their own differentiation in the market, which means that the tier one has to keep pace with that demand for new services. Today it's maybe SD-WAN, tomorrow it's blockchain, etc. Now, like Drew was mentioning earlier, there's no way that we can invest in 6 to 8 months to launch a service anymore. It's all about where Anil started, with every operator wants service agility, right? So, but the systems that existed a year back really did not bring service orchestration, resource orchestration, closed loop automation really together. So that is what we work towards. And some of the key drivers that motivated us was rapid service introduction that I just talked about. But let me define for you the environment that we work with, right? So if you look at the complexity of the environment right now that we're dealing with, is not only do you have both physical and virtual elements to deal with, but even in the virtualized arena, you've got multiple data centers. So they're a global company, and that means tens of data centers are spread across the world, and each of these data centers might have multiple clouds, and each cloud could actually be a different technology, even if it's a difference in version of the virtual infrastructure manager. You could be on VMware or OpenStack, and even in OpenStack you could be on Kilo versus Newton, etc. So then on top of that, now that we have network functions coming in as softwares, you're dealing with an IT-like process where you get frequent releases, which means that at any given point in your operations, you're probably going to have multiple versions of the same network function. Multiply that with the number of network functions you need. So when you take a new environment like that, and you try to provide the same service assurance, right? The same level of assurance, which is super important to not only this customer that we dealt with, but also every customer that we encounter. You really need a new age approach to it, and that approach really drives the need for a new age assurance tool as well. Now, and of course, what helps, what is absolutely table stakes is end-to-end management. But how do you take all of these complexities, all of this variability, and actually create a set of systems that allow for seamless management and closed loop automation, etc. So we brought in we really focused on three main areas to achieve that, right? The first area was around what we call is VNF and service lifecycle certification. Some of the most amount of time that an operator in our view spends today on is just to interact with a new VNF vendor, operationalize, bring that VNF, certify it, operationalize it in their network, make sure it really actually works on their own platform. And this includes many aspects of a VNF, from functional aspects to performance to assurance aspects, security, everything. By the time you're done validating all of that, unless you have a automated platform to do so, it actually can take you 6 to 8 months, depending on the complexity of the VNF. So that's one area we focused on to say, how do I reduce that to days rather than months? The second thing we focused on was the entire idea of service automation, right? So again, just because you have a VNF doesn't automatically mean that you have a service in place or that you have a sellable and a provisionable service which can not only go across an operator's data centers, but also, remember, this is enterprise. So you're looking at VCP as well, which is, in itself quite a challenging area to work with. So you can have, on a single order, you can have hundreds of locations that have to be served with these virtual CPs, which they themselves are mini data centers, if you want to look at it like that. So what you're now orchestrating is not just that, spinning up a few VNFs in a data center, but you're spinning up VNFs in all of these VCPs and connecting them up to realize that service. onboarding such a design and operationalizing it to a point where it can be a few clicks was the other area that we really focused on, and this is where the Ericsson's dynamic orchestration really helped, because it has all of these layers which combine service orchestration with resource orchestration based on HC principles and model-driven activation. Now, the third part, this is all well and good where you can onboard VNFs and services and operationalize them, but then you have to assure them in the environment that I just described, which means that if you have a failure at the very bottom of the stack at a blade level, you got to really correlate that all the way to the customer impacted, which means you're going through many layers of a disaggregated architecture now, right? You're looking at the hardware, you're looking at the hypervisor, you're looking at VMs, then you're looking at the application, and then the service, and then the customer, right? If the new assurance approach cannot take care of this immediate correlation, we have already failed as an industry, right? So that's the demand on the new assurance. But then we also wanted to take advantage of the new agility that virtualization brings to us, which means that I should be able to recover from any of these issues in real time as well, which means that which meant that AssureNow had to talk to the orchestrator and really be part of that whole closed loop to create that. And this is where AssureNow was not only able to monitor the entire network, but also create intelligent alerts back into the orchestrator. And then orchestrator is able to, I should say, take remedial action. And remedial action could be just spinning up new VNFs in the same data center, or a completely new data center, scaling up, scaling down, etc. So to me, each of these pillars, are important in the journey to really meet the demands that the customer was placing on us.
Excellent remarks, Anup. If I may ask a question at this point, what do you see the market opportunity for this type of solutions moving forward, and which driver will customers look to prioritize? Among the things you've explained, which driver will customers look to prioritize, or are meeting all these goals equally weighted to deliver success?
Good question. And Anil, in a way, you kind of answered it in the very beginning of your deck when you talked about service agility, right? I mean, if service agility is the differentiator that an operator has to have, right? There is no way that you can really place one or the other in front of the other. You have to have these three elements go together. That's exactly why we had to go down this path. We started with a problem statement, and the solution came later just to address that issue. So I think the market opportunity is huge, and you cannot really take advantage of being in this market if you do not have the three elements working together as a unit.
Okay. All right. So I will then move to the next slide. So we're just coming to closing in on the nearing the end of this presentation. So I'll just make some final remarks and summarize what we have discussed today, and sort of just look at what is this. So we've talked about the new age service assurance, and Drew talked about some excellent examples of how they're doing it, and he talked about Air and their engagement with AssureNow. Anup talked about his experience delivering this project for this enterprise customer in partnership with Monolith Software, AssureNow. So I just want to wrap up by making some comments on when we look at the new age service assurance, what are the key characteristics, just to bring it all together. So to deliver service agility in NFV and hybrid networks, so we made a point that, okay, so let's make a start today. Let's start thinking about unifying some of the assurance capabilities, so you have a good base to start thinking about NFV operations and achieving the service agility and the high levels of automation there. So the key business principles that are highlighted here, obviously, to start with, it's got to be a cloud. The architecture, so there are two aspects of cloud here. So the cloud architecture itself. So we talked about cloud native right at the start of the presentation. So as networks eventually move towards cloud native, the assurance platform, if I use the term, has to also start looking like a cloud native application. So what that means is it's got to be built using microservices with APIs and so on and so forth. But then the second element of this cloud is also that NFV, as it starts to become a reality, will start to look like a cloud, right? So the assurance, not only should it start to move towards a cloud-native architecture by itself, but also start to start supporting cloud architectures, in this case NFV enabled by SDN. Analytics is going to be a big component of service assurance. So everything that Anup and Drew were explaining about the closed-loop automation, how do you enable that? So there is going to be massive amounts of data created from the network. So you've got to be able to correlate that, make sense of it, and then drive actions based on policies. And all of this needs to happen in a near real-time fashion, and that's going to be enabled by analytics. Automation goes without saying. It must be quite obvious by now that automation is absolutely a pivotal requirement for service assurance for the new age NFV and hybrid networks. So service assurance within service assurance has to, the components of service assurance has to drive automation, as well as it has to drive automation by integrating with adjacent components like service orchestration and resource orchestration, like Anup was talking about. And real time sort of goes hand in hand with the analytics type use cases that would be required to be implemented for NFV operations. So analytics will drive real time. And the other point about analytics I missed mentioning is the increasing use of machine learning. So as we move towards NFV and the need for real time operations, autonomous operations, machine learning will need to be employed more and more. And just to round it off with some comments on open platforms. So when I said microservices and the use of APIs for a cloud architecture, it also means that the APIs will support and sort of make the platform into an open platform. So it can be easily integrated, and the APIs could be called upon in a much more dynamic fashion in runtime operations to drive automation. And high availability, clearly, with NFV being on cloud architecture, it sort of provides a level of high availability inherently. But then if service assurance is not equally highly available, then the operations falls apart. So obviously some of the aspects such as cloud native architecture and being an open platform supports the capability of high availability. So that has to be also high on the agenda.
Great, thank you very much to all the speakers. In fact, that was really interesting. Encouragingly, we've had a lot of interesting questions in from the audience as well. So I look forward to presenting those to our panel in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to get into the first of two poll questions we've got, which I think will be really useful to gauge the perception among the audience. The first question is: when does your organization plan to mitigate the future risks of new technology adoption? And we're thinking of technologies like NFV, 5G, virtualization, and the hybrid era. And so the question is, when does your organization plan to mitigate the future risks of new technology through OSS-BSS transformation by acquiring new technology and replacing old tools? And the possible responses are: first, currently in transformation, we'll do so in the next 12 months, we'll do so in the next 2 to 4 years, we'll do so in the next 5 to 10 years, and finally have no plans to acquire new technology or replace old tools. So the question again, when does your organization plan to mitigate future risks of new technology adoption through OSS/BSS transformation? And the possible responses are currently in transformation, we'll do so in the next 12 months, we'll do so in the next 2 to 4 years, we'll do so in the next 5 to 10 years, or have no plans. And let's see what the results are. Interesting spread across the breadth of the audience. It's interesting to me to see that nearly a third, well, between a quarter and a third, are currently in transformation, and that's actually the largest percentage of respondents. But and also it's interesting to note that only 2.5% or so will wait 5 years before transforming. So I think that's certainly an interesting finding, and suggests that people are either going down a path that they expect to complete within the next 4 years, or have not engaged with the issues really yet. Would any of the panelists like to comment on these findings? Or perhaps we'll address that in the questions later. Let's move on to the next poll question, which is, which of the following technologies will be most important to such a transformation? And the options are machine learning and analytics, elastic scale via containers and microservices, dashboards providing one pane of glass visualization, smartphone apps, improved consolidated operations platform, or closed-loop orchestration. And I'll ask the question again, which of the following technologies will be most important to such a transformation? The options are machine learning and analytics, elastic scale via containers and microservices, dashboards providing one pane of glass visualization, smartphone apps, improved consolidated operations platform, or closed-loop orchestration. Let's see what the result for this poll is. And, that's very interesting that closed-loop orchestration is seen as one of the most important technology to enable the transformation. And interestingly, that's followed by machine learning and analytics. That's some very interesting findings that we've got there. Let's move on to the questions that we've received from the audience, and I'll put those to the panel. The first question I'd like to ask has come in from one of the audience today, and the question really centers on the fact that legacy OSS products can't support NFV and SDN, and the questioner is asking how the issues can be addressed in the hybrid era with legacy OSS products in place. And Drew, I'd like to put that question to you initially. What are the challenges of addressing the hybrid era with legacy OSS?
Well, honestly, I think it would be quite painful, because I'm honestly taken back that you could even get there, just knowing the tools so well, having worked more than 20 years in the industry. And I'll just give a few examples. First off, these new virtual network devices are being churned out at a rate much faster than legacy hardware. So, when for example, when Cisco turn out a new piece of hardware, that takes a long time, because you're developing both hardware and then you're reusing or developing a new operating system. In a lot of cases, they're using a legacy operating system and really just introducing some new technologies within that. And so these hardware devices churn out very slowly, whereas with these new NFV vendors, you'll have companies that you may not have even ever heard of that are oftentimes first to market, and these devices are updated very quickly, because it's just software. And so, being able to onboard these new devices and not having to wait for legacy vendors that will often take 6 to 9 months to support these new devices, I think is absolutely critical.
Great, thank you, Drew. Another question's come in. It says, if NFV and orchestration or orchestrators have the capability to fix some of the issues, what will be the impact on operations in the NOC first level? Who would like to take that question?
Yeah, actually, I could have a go at that. Honestly, the fact that you have these new devices coming on board quickly, and as they come on board, you want them natively to be able to communicate with orchestration systems and with your operations system, right? And so from an operations perspective, as these new devices come on board, you don't want to go through the legacy challenges of introducing additional noise to already a crammed operations center, right? So at the same point that we're looking to drive down costs in operations by consolidating operation centers, we're also onboarding significant quantities of net new devices, and you just don't have an opportunity to introduce new noise. So these new devices that come on board have to have built-in noise reduction through closed-loop orchestration and through smarter intelligence behind the scenes, so that when operation center is presented with a bona fide problem, it is a bona fide problem. And that's really where I see us going.
Great, excellent, thank you. I've got another question that's come in. The question is, how will topology be relevant in the NFV reality as logical VNF components, dependencies, and traffic, perhaps, asks the questioner. And I'd open that to the panel for answering.
Yeah, I can go with that. So it's the question around topology, and as VNFs change states or become part of new service chains, how do you maintain that? Actually, that's the answer, to be honest. So in today's world where the physical networks are designed, so that there's a lot of planning and inventory updates that happens as networks come on board. So this all happens as your because you've got a big plan to do the network rollout. So it's all planned out. So you've got a really a good project plan to do this, so to speak. But then in the NFV world, the VNFs are going to be instantiated dynamically, right? So it's more in a real-time fashion. So the topology, so if you contrast what happens today in the physical network, the topology is sort of more or less set, but it does change, but not as frequently, right? And even if it did, you have advance notice, significant advance notice of when the network is going to change. So you can plan for that. But then if you contrast that in NFV, the VNFs are going to be created. That's the intention, right? So because the service design, as Anup was saying, the service orchestration, so the rapid design and deployment of services, the whole concept there is that it's a top-down approach. So you design a service, and then you basically provision the network based on that. So as a result of that service provisioning, it could mean that you need to create new VNFs. So as those new VNFs are created, you've got to continuously update the topology. So the VNFs, how does the VNF stitch together as part of a service chain, and where was this VNF slash VM created? So you need to have a direct linkage between that newly created VNF VM and the underlying hardware. So it could be in any of the data centers, as Anup was explaining. So by definition, the topology in the NFV environment has to be a real-time topology. So we can't have offline topology; it wouldn't work. So real-time topology is the answer. But then the second dimension to this is from a troubleshooting perspective, right? So if an error occurs and through the closed loop assurance and orchestration process, the remediation action was taken to to either the simple of the use cases would be, okay, so there's a problem occurred, and you just go and create a new VNF, right? But then you still have to go and actually find the problem, right? So what actually created that VNF to cause a problem? So you still have to troubleshoot. And while you're doing that, the topology is already changed, right? So because you've created a new VNF, you've introduced new VNF into the service chain, the service availability and service quality is fine, the customer's happy, but you still have to go and troubleshoot as to why that VNF created a problem 5 minutes ago. So the topology needs to also have a capability to support such troubleshooting use cases where it enables you to go back in time. So sort of a time-lapse sort of view of the topology as to what was the topology when this when this error occurred, which caused the VNF to cause problems. So there are a couple of dimensions to this. One is the real-time aspect of topology, and secondly, it's to support the troubleshooting and assurance use cases.
Great, thank you. Very good answer. Next, let's move on to, this is a question that goes right to the heart of operator strategies. How do we measure the return on investment made on NFV and SDN transformations by service providers? And I guess there are several different answers to this, but I'll put that to the panel and see what we get.
Yeah, so this is Anup, I'll take this. So from depends on the operator and the business they are in. So for example, in the enterprise, for the operators who serve the enterprise market, this is going to be all about how quickly can they launch service, what's their time to market, what is their operational agility, how can they reduce their manual touches, what new services can they bring, and how do doors open in the new world with 5G coming along and IoT and all of those use cases. When it comes to operators who are not necessarily in the enterprise space but more on the consumer space, it's all going to be about scale and operations, right? So and operations in terms of, again, goes back to can you reduce your OpEx and CapEx, and how much of that can you reduce versus the investment you're making? And some studies have shown that that there is definitely potential of reduction in both OpEx and CapEx with virtualization. That is the whole idea. When it comes to creating again services that they launch to the market really quickly. Even the more static consumer space is actually going to see a boom with new services coming in, especially with IoT and 5G. So there's a lot of potential here, and I think the biggest business case is that you really is a question of survival. Really, if you do not go into NFV SDN, how do you survive in a competitive market, which is going to be way more agile with these technologies?
Great, thank you, Anup. That was very good. Are there any other comments from the panel, or should we move on? No, I think it's time to move on. Unfortunately, we've had such a great webinar that we're now running out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid. So I'd like to thank the panel, Anup Agrawal, the Vice President and Head of Enterprise Architecture and End-to-End Solutioning at Ericsson Digital Services, Drew Golden, the Senior Director of Product Management at AssureNow, and Anil Rao, the Senior Analyst at Analysis Mason. Thanks also to the audience for joining us. We've had a fascinating discussion, and there are lots of questions that we will answer that we didn't have time to answer during the session. We'll do those by email, and you can listen to the presentations again from tomorrow at vanillaplus.com. Thanks again for attending. I've been George Malim, the Managing Editor of Vanilla Plus. Goodbye.